Professor Claudio Cressati from the University of Udine. We have been, I think we heard the word freedom navigation this morning, and my question would be, can the European Union truly guarantee the freedom of navigation, or does it still lack the political and operational means to do so? Please, Claudio.
So, thank you very much for the invitation, Shukran. Grazie. I will, don't worry, I will not speak about Hugo van den Groot or Thomas Hobbes, although I am a historian political thought by training, so you will understand my quotations. So, this, what we are currently seeing is that our century can be described as a maritime century. It is not the first time, but it is true that in an era of hyper-globalization, around 90% of global trade by volume and 95% of international digital information transits by sea. This is no longer merely an auxiliary theater of diplomatic maneuvering, but passive highway of trade. It is a vital circulatory system of global power, economic interdependence, and geopolitical competition. For the European Union, this profound maritime dependency generates an acute strategic vulnerability. Historically, the Union, as we know, has operated as an example of civilian power, normative actor that projects global influence through the export of rules, institutional structures, and regulatory harmonization. This position is deeply rooted in what we might call the Grotian idea, philosophical and legal assumptions that the oceans constitute a res communis, a common heritage of humanity governed by laws, mutual recognition of sovereignty, and multilateral consensus. According to this paradigm, maritime access is considered as a self-evident legal right, guaranteed by treaties and upheld by a shared interest in global stability. Today, however, as we have already seen, we are witnessing the systemic decay of this rules-based maritime order. Global maritime commons are rapidly shifting from this Grotian arena of cooperative jurisdiction to a highly contested cohesion space, defined by pure power projection, territorial revisionism, and geopolitical fiction. Revisionist states and asymmetric non-state actors alike are increasingly challenging traditional ocean governance regimes, testing the limits of international law, and asserting unilateral control over strategic transit corridors, the choke points that Lorenzo has highlighted. For Europe, this represents an existential challenge. If the Union wants to safeguard its economic survival, preserve its digital integrity, and maintain its capacity for geopolitical action, it must critically confront its own maritime paradox. The reality of being a global economic giant that remains structurally dependent on maritime security architecture it cannot currently secure on its own. I will try to highlight 5 pillars of this challenge: the systematic weaponization of international law, the widening gap between maritime policy and sea control, the emergence of the underwater border as a critical site of vulnerability, the institutional bottlenecks of EU security policy, and the operational roadmap required to build a credible European maritime posture. So, from Hugo van den Groot to Thomas Hobbes, the limits of normative power. My first point is concerns the effectiveness of international legal regimes in an era of geostrategic revisions. So the question is, can the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Seas, the so-called Constitution of the Oceans, survive as a stabilizing force when confronted with systematic legal warfare, so-called lawfare? As you know, UNCLOS, Italian spelling, is valued for its capacity to establish clear jurisdictional boundaries, defining the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, seas, and so on. However, the foundational limitation limits of UNCLOS lies in its inherently retrospective and conceptual architecture. It is a legal framework designed to codify an existing geopolitical equilibrium. It lacks the intrinsic capacity to enforce that equilibrium when it is actively challenged by powerful actors. Today, revisionist powers do not necessarily seek to completely dismantle UNCLOS. Instead, they engage in a sophisticated lawfare, that is, the strategic exploitation of legal ambiguities and the creative reinterpretation of treaty provisions to achieve kinetic and territorial advantages. We observe this in the growing jurisdiction of EEZ, quoted, where coastal states attempt to restrict foreign military surveys or naval transits, effectively transforming international waters into sovereign sanctuaries. We observe this also, for instance, in the South China Sea, where the construction of artificial islands is used to claim maritime zones, creating facts on the water, not facts on the ground, that bypass international arbitration and treaty-based definitions. In this highly contested context, international law is not self-executing. Legal legitimacy provides certainly the essential ethical and political justification to act, but it lacks the material power to deter physical transgression. When a state unilaterally closes a strait, or when an asymmetric actor deploys munitions to deny access to shipping lanes, a purely normative response is functionally obsolete. To defend the rules-based order, the European Union must shift from a position of legal optimism to a position of legal realism. This realism recognizes that international law is only as strong as the deterrent power available to enforce it. Without a credible naval presence capable of signaling immediate kinetic consequences, normative declarations and legal protests risk being reduced to empty diplomatic rhetoric, ignored by those who prioritize power over limits. The deterrence deficit. My second point. Over the past 3 decades, European maritime security operations, as you know, we have conducted security operations, have been primarily policy in nature. Operation Atalanta, which is the operation of the Horn of Africa, is often quoted as a successful example of European Union maritime cooperation. It was successful, certainly, because it was essentially a high-level policy operation directed against non-state asymmetric pirate groups, the so-called pirate groups, who possessed no anti-ship capabilities, no air defenses, and no capacity to contest the naval environment. Similarly, the Operation Irene in the Mediterranean was designed to enforce an arms embargo under permissive or semi-permissive conditions in the war in Libya, but there have been many problems, especially coming from Turkey or Turkey. However, the contemporary security landscape demands a completely different set of capabilities. The operational environment has shifted from low intensity policing to high intensity contested sea control. Deployment of operations Aspides in the Red Sea to defend merchant shipping, reported also, against Houthi-led drone and ballistic missile attacks, marks a watershed movement. It has exposed the serious structural limitation of European naval forces when operating within active anti-access area zones. European navies are currently structured as national champions rather than a coherent and integrated force. When deployed in contested theaters of operation, they face several critical and structural bottlenecks. First, the depletion of kinetic ammunition. So, high-intensity defense against cheap autonomous munitions and anti-ship ballistic missiles requires sophisticated and extremely expensive air defense interceptors. European destroyers, European ships have a limited number of the so-called vertical launch systems. And our defense industry supply chains are structurally incapable of rapidly replenishing these munitions resources. Second, the fragility of logistics and auxiliary resources. A navy's reach is not defined by its combat units, but by its auxiliary fleets. European forces suffer from a severe shortage of tankers, cargo ships, and mobile repair platforms. And this limits our ability to sustain career strike groups or surface naval groups far from the European home ports. Third, the absence of a unified command and control. Unlike NATO, which has a mature and highly integrated military command structure, the EU Common Security and Defense Policy relies on ad hoc operational headquarters provided by individual member states on a rotational basis. This fragmentation severely hinders the strategic speed, tactical fluidity, and digital interoperability required to manage a high-intensity maritime war. The undersea frontier, the maritime access, the third point is undersea. Because we have to expand our traditional definition of maritime security, geopolitical competition is no longer confined to the surface of water, it has descended to the seabed. The undersea frontier has emerged as the most critical. The physical substratum of European globalization is fragile. The sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea and also the damage to the Baltic Connector pipeline demonstrated that critical energy infrastructure can be targeted with relative impunity. Even more critical is the vulnerability of undersea fiber optic data cables. A significant percentage of these cables transit through highly congested choke points, such as the English Channel, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea. seabed warfare requires highly specialized and technically advanced capabilities. These capabilities, Europe doesn't, only few member states have some piece of these capabilities. This vulnerability is directly linked to the concept of European strategic autonomy. If the Union cannot independently secure its underwater infrastructure, its geopolitical agency is fundamentally compromised. So if you remain dependent on the security guarantees of external allies, specifically the United States, to police our waters and protect our cables, we remain security consumers and not security providers. And as the United States continues its inevitable long-term strategic pivot towards the Indo-Pacific to counter China, the maritime security of the European neighborhood must become primarily a European responsibility. Fourth pillar, institutional bottlenecks. So the primary bottleneck to European strategic agency is neither technological nor financial. It is institutional. Under current treaty framework, as you know, decisions within the common foreign security and defense policy requires security and defense policy requires the unanimous consent of all 27 member states. This unanimity creates a structural incentive for the lowest common denominator strategy. So the least that we saw that friction during the initial planning phases of Operation Aspides, as I quote. But we have a chance. Fortunately, the Treaty of the European Union provides a largely underused mechanism. Article 44 of the treaty. This provision allows the Council to entrust the implementation of a CSDP task to a group of member states willing and possessing the necessary capability for such a task. By making Article 44 operational, the EU could authorize naval rapid reaction forces composed of a coalition of the willing under the EU banner, bypassing the need for absolute consensus on every tactical decisions. Furthermore, we must leverage PESCO, Permanent Structural Cooperation, and the European Defence Fund to move from fragmented, national-centric research and development to collaborative, standardized procurement. Fine. The road, if we ask, can the European Union realistically act as an autonomous guarantor of freedom of navigation today? The realistic answer is no. However, if we reframe the question, can the EU evolve into an indispensable and effective co-guarantor of the rules-based maritime order? The answer is a conditional yes. But we have to do something to reach this, to obtain this goal. First, we have to move from normative optimism to legal realism. Second, from fragmented fleet to a unified naval mass using PESCO and EDF. And fourth, we have to move from institutional paralysis to strategic agility using Article 44 of the treaty. Thank you very much.